As you know, classically, the great benefit of mindfulness is really wisdom or insight. It's seeing things clearly. So it's not just inhabiting your life, it's understanding your life, the sources of suffering, the possibility of freedom, the path to be more free. And how alone are we really? We feel so disconnected, but is that the truth of things? There's so many discoveries to be made along that path.
Welcome to the Garrison Institute Presents The Common Good. I'm Jonathan F.P. co-founder of the Garrison Institute, and today our honored guest is Sharon Salzberg. Sharon Salzberg is a meditation pioneer, a renowned spiritual teacher, and a New York Times best-selling author. Her influential work has shaped the modern contemplative landscape of practices. She is a co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society and a prolific author. Her latest books include Real Life, A Journey from Isolation to Openness, and Freedom and Real Happiness. Sharon has dedicated her career to exploring the transformative power of compassion, mindfulness, and loving kindness. Sharon, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be with you.
It is really wonderful to see you, and it's particularly wonderful to think about compassion in what are these generally uncompassionate times. So I want to go back in time to the times that we both really grew up, which was a time of much more hope and optimism, although it was clouded by a series of, the Vietnam War and some other things too. So take us back to where you were in your life and what led you to your first journey to India.
Well, I went to college at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and I do think about those times so often because the parallels to now are pretty striking. The Vietnam War was going on. There was a lot of political discord. There was a lot of alienation between generations. Psychedelics were all around. I mean, it was just like, wow, what an interesting thing. And when I was in college, I was a sophomore, and I took an Asian philosophy course, which honestly, looking back, felt almost like happenstance. Like I looked at the schedule, I thought, oh, that's on Tuesday. That fits nicely, So I did that one, and the course completely changed my life in two ways. One was the Buddha section, the Buddha talking very openly about suffering in life. And I, like many people, had a childhood in a family system that was full of conflict and chaos and trauma. And it was also a family where nothing was ever spoken about. And so I just felt different than everybody else and weird, and I didn't know what to do with all those feelings inside of me. So for many people, of course, hearing the Buddha talk about suffering, it's a rather depressing message. But for me, it was liberating because I felt I belong. I'm a part of life. And then in the course of that class, I heard that there were methods and practices called meditation that if you wanted to, you could practice and you'd be a lot happier. And something inside of me, which is the big mystery of my life, lit up. And I thought, I've got to learn. I wasn't, so much of my habit patterns were like standing back, being on the outside, being passive, but I just thought, I've got to learn. So I looked around Buffalo. This is 1970, 1969. I looked around Buffalo. I didn't see it anywhere because it was a different time. And the university had an independent study program, and I created a project saying, I want to go to India and study meditation. And they said yes. So that's how I ended up in India.
That's amazing. And there, you actually met some teachers.
Mm-hmm. I met many teachers. I mean, I was really caught with the idea of the direct practical instruction. That's what I really wanted. I wasn't really interested in comparative religion or philosophical analysis. I wanted to know the really straight, how do you do it, how do I get to be happier? And so that was really my burning desire. And it took a while to find that approach. And I started in January of 1971 with S.N. Goenka, who was teaching these intensive 10-day kind of immersion retreats, very much like that, based on method and practice and how do you do it, and met a cluster of teachers around him in that same town, and then went on and studied with some Tibetan teachers, and it just hasn't stopped since January of 1971.
And you also met a community of friends.
Yes.
You found yourself all of a sudden on the outside, actually on the inside.
Yeah.
And then you came back to America and you founded IMS, really, I think, on some of the foundations of Goenka.
Yeah. Yeah, very much. Stylistically, it wasn't, in terms of method, it was not sort of streamlined toward one insight meditation approach as his lineage is. But in terms of like the course structure and the idea of silence and things like that, it was very much based on his style. Yeah, I mean, I was introduced to that first Goenka course in January of 1971 by Dan Goleman, who was, a close mutual friend. And I met Joseph Goldstein at that first retreat, and Ram Dass and Krishnadas, and so many people who really became lifelong friends. And it was a very pronounced aspect of what was happening there, because we felt like we were discovering, and we were all like pretty new to meditation practice. And it was all so exciting, and we were just gathered together in that spirit of discovery. It was wonderful.
And then you came back to America and you actually founded an institution now. And we know that's not such an easy thing to do. So how did that happen?
Well, I mean, the story of my coming back and teaching is really the story of one of my teachers, this woman named Deepa Ma, or Deepa's mother. It's kind of a nickname. So I went to India in 1970. I came back like 72. I stayed a little longer than my junior year abroad. I came back to finish school, which was really writing papers and things like that at that point. Got 2 years of independent study credit and went back to India to continue practice. So in 1974, I knew I had to go back to the States and get a new visa and do these things. And I was convinced, absolutely convinced, that I was going to spend the rest of my life in India as a student. So I went to see this teacher, Deepa Ma, who lived in Calcutta, for her blessing from my very, very short journey back to the U.S. And she said to me, when you go back, you'll be teaching. And I said, no, I won't. And she said, yes, you will. And I said, no, I won't. I thought it was ludicrous, in my mind. I mean, it wasn't like a career path in those days. It was something I never even dreamt I was capable of doing. And she kept saying, yes, you will. And I said, no, I won't. And she said, yes, you will. And then she said two things that were very important. She said, you really understand suffering. That's why you should teach, which I'm sure we're going to talk about compassion at some point, And then she said, you can do anything you want to do. It's your thinking you can't do it that's going to stop you. And I left. She lived up these 4 flights of stairs. I walked down those stairs thinking, no, I won't. That's ridiculous. I'm never going to do that. And I got back. Joseph Goldstein, whom I'd met at my first retreat, at this point, it was the first summer of Naropa Institute. They were just opening up. He was sort of Ram Dass's TA at that experience. A bunch of us, newly back from India, thought, let's go visit Joseph in Boulder. So we went to visit Joseph, and I ended up staying. Jack Cornfield was living down the hall. That's where I met him. And I ended up staying for the second summer session where Joseph was teaching, and I was sort of his TA. And the whole time I kept thinking, I'm going back to India soon. I'm going back to India soon. And then we got some invitations to lead retreats. And then we got more invitations to lead retreats. And then we got more. And one day I woke up and I thought, oh, she was right. This is my life. And we had nothing, we were living in people's couches and going from house to house. And one of the people whose house we were often crashing in said, I think in some defense, I have a rental property down near Santa Cruz. Why don't you go stay there? So we went there and we invited people who were interested in doing retreats just to come through and we would feed them and stuff like that. And somebody came through and said, why don't you start a real retreat center? It would be, as you know, it would be like a kind of sacred site in this country. It would be a repository for the kind of energy that doesn't have to dissipate at the end of people coming together with common purpose. And he said, I know all the people who can help you. They're in Massachusetts. And he was right. And so we ended up looking up and down the East Coast and finally settled on this retreat center in Barrie.
And it's been an amazing place. So meditation, you had this wonderful, you were growing as a meditation teacher, but somewhere along the way you discovered that in some ways the essential ingredient was actually compassion. It wasn't necessarily meditation, it was compassion.
Mm-hmm.
So talk about that.
Well, I mean, meditation is a skills training. The most popular word is probably mindfulness in describing one of the skills, but really mindfulness is also, it will do many things. And most of the time when people talk about mindfulness, they're talking about more fully inhabiting your life, like really taste that cup of coffee when you're drinking it and don't just multitask all the time. And that, of course, is a huge benefit. But as you know, classically, the great benefit of mindfulness is really wisdom or insight. It's seeing things clearly. So it's not just inhabiting your life, it's understanding your life, the sources of suffering, the possibility of freedom, the path to be more free. And how alone are we really? We feel so disconnected, but is that the truth of things? There's so many discoveries to be made along that path. And one of the qualities that you can see it both ways, it's a natural outgrowth of wisdom. The more we see how truly connected we all are, the more there's a kind of natural compassion and generosity and so on that arise. But you can also see it as something we cultivate as we experiment with how we pay attention. Like if we are really in the habit of being kind of miserable to ourselves and we just, we make a mistake and we freak out like we're the worst person in the world, you can make a little experiment and say, what's it like when mistakes are mistakes and we don't need to ignore that. But what is it like when I don't denounce myself for the next year and a half, for that mistake? And we experiment. So I was really entranced by that possibility of a very purposeful, intentional experimentation in life so that I was relating to myself differently in a more compassionate way and learning to relate to others, listening and recognizing kind of the poignancy of things that maybe, someone is so caught up, they're so ensnared in their own mind that they are acting in a harmful way. But look at how diminished they are, that's worthy of compassion. And it also, there's a tremendous exploration to be had with what does it mean and what does it not mean, because it sounds so stupid in so many ways. Like, this person is carrying on in this harmful way and you're talking about loving kindness and compassion. Like, how dumb are you? So it takes a lot of exploration to know what it actually means.
It does. One day, Deanne and I were wrestling with whether we should fire somebody or not. And Gallic Rinpoche, who was a great teacher we had, who you knew, turned to us and said, keeping that person on is idiot compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, it's not for their benefit or your benefit for them to keep failing to do this job,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
move them on. And so true compassion. So let's describe from your point of view, what is true compassion? Because true compassion doesn't just always mean you're lovey-dovey in the world.
Mm-hmm. First, I want to say how much I love Gallic Rinpoche and how one of the really amazing things, I think, for us as a generation was having models of people, who they've suffered, they were not cushy lives by and large, living in exile or, like Thich Nhat Hanh, a war-torn country, and yet this is what they come down to, is not hatred or fear, not even anguish in a way, but really a compassionate heart. So the classical definition of compassion starts with kind of a resonance, like the trembling or the quivering of the heart when we witness pain or suffering. And the second part of the definition is it's a movement toward. So it's a movement toward seeing if we can be of help. The liberating quality of compassion, of something like loving kindness or compassion, is that it's an internal state of freedom. It's not a mandate for a certain kind of action. If we're motivated by this kind of resonance and caring, seeing if we can be of help, then that doesn't mean we're going to be so sweet all the time or only say yes or let them have more money or let them move back in or, I, as I'm sure you as well, have visited him in jail. Does that mean I have to give up everything? Does that mean I have to let them hurt me? Does that mean I have to let these other people be oppressed? And it doesn't mean any of that, but the heart space, the motivation for action is not separation and division and hatred.
So there's a particular, I was going to call them class, but group of people who in Americans, in the world society, the caregivers, the people who have really committed their lives to compassionate action through being nurses and hospital emergency room workers and frontline workers of all different kinds working in refugee camps. So you and Deanna Rose, the co-founder of the Garrison Institute, and my wonderful wife, co-created a program for these people. So talk a little bit about that, because those are the people who are really living in not only their own suffering, they're living in a vast sea of suffering. And how does compassion relate to their work?
Well, first, I also want to give all due honor to Deanna, because this was born completely in her mind and heart, and, she came to me one day and said, I want to do something for people who care for other people. Now, I find it fascinating work, and I've learned and continue to learn so much. Mostly, I think we can have a kind of conditioning, any one of us, that is pretty self-centered. We want to get ahead. We're taught it's a dog-eat-dog world. Don't help anybody else, because they're not going to help you. You're on your own. And we're kind of hyper-competitive and belittling of others. And so the obvious remedy, the antidote is open up to others. Don't be so self-centered. Don't be so consumed with only thinking of yourself. And so we hear, of course, great teachers talk about that all the time. What fascinated me about these people is that they were conditioned, it seemed, or at least they were operating in a different way. They cared tremendously about others. They had enormous empathy and care, and they were, as you said, in a sea of suffering. But the person they would tend to have less compassion for was themselves. And it was just a fascinating dynamic to see. I mean, we all share a little bit of that, I think, anyway, but it's very prevalent in people who are working to care for other people. And, in a time different than our time right now, when empathy was kind of praised and it wasn't, put down.
Oh, because, empathy is still, just because we have certain people in leadership who are not empathetic, I think empathy is still a human trait that many societies value. So keep going.
Great. Excellent. But I would hear things about empathy training, which I thought was wonderful. But then I'd look at the nurses and the refugee workers and all these people, and I think, well, they've got plenty of empathy. They're burning out for some other reason. So what's missing, and often what seemed to be missing, was a kind of balance, either including themselves in that circle of care and or a kind of perspective taking, unreasonable expectations of what success would look like in a dynamic, of care, or not having what we would call equanimity, some sort of balance around that. Because the reality is systems are hard to move, and there are layers and layers and layers. The last time I was zooming into the Garrison Institute for a retreat for caregivers, a nurse raised her hand and she said, I don't know that I'm so much experiencing stress and burnout. I'm experiencing moral injury. These are complex systems and there are all kinds of considerations. And people, I think, need both a sense of community, that they're not so alone and soldiering on, and methods, techniques to kind of care for themselves in a better way.
So you co-created a program with others too that provides those methods. So you want to talk about the ABCs of care?
Awareness, balance, and connection. Yeah, I mean, it's a mutuality. I found that the first retreat, the contemplative-based resilience program at the Garrison Institute that we taught, we had about 60 people or social workers, people in the domestic violence world, because that's where we started. And I noted that of the many things people asked for recordings of at the end so they could take them home and keep practicing, one was the kind of didactic or more theoretical explanation of what stress does to the nervous system, to the brain and the body and so on. Because so much of the time we feel pathological in our distress instead of realizing that's normal. That's a nervous system. Or as people sometimes describe trauma, it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, and it was so reassuring for people to hear, oh yeah, this is what happens. It's okay. I'm not a bad caregiver or, something like that. And then different practices, the movement, the embodiment practices to sort of get that relief or sense of solace in the body, and meditation, especially loving kindness meditation, which included themselves. And that was really kind of an eye-opener that those were the things people were cherishing the most.
Mm. And the program has had enormous effect, positive benefit to people all over the world in frontline situations like refugee camps. But one of the things I think that you and Deanna learned along the way was that we actually had a society or a care system that didn't value the care worker. Mm-hmm. So they said that burnout was just a cost of business. And what you've really been advocating for is that we have to care for our caregivers. Mm-hmm. We actually, as a social system, as an economic system, as a service delivery system, have to have compassion for these people who are doing the compassionate work on behalf of all of us.
Well, we need them. I don't know. I mean, being of an age now where, my parents died a long time ago, but being at the funerals of many people whose parents are dying, I don't remember a family ever attending the funeral without standing up and saying, we totally depended on so-and-so. She helped my dad die at home. She helped him die with dignity. Always, when there is a caregiver involved, there's a tremendous generosity of the spirit, and we need them, that was what I saw the first time we did the retreat for domestic violence shelter workers. I thought, what would we do if, society is counting on these people,
right,
to do their work.
So they're an essential part, actually, of the fabric of the commons and the common good.
Yeah.
So I just want to wind back and challenge one thing you said, mm-hmm. which is you used the phrase a dog-eat-dog world. I happen to have a dog, and I walk my dog with a lot of other dogs, and I have seen dogs sniff each other and want to play each other. I've never seen dogs want to eat each other. And the reason I say that is because, you're not the only one. Lots of people say dog-eat-dog world. So it's part of a mental construct. It's kind of like what I'm going to propose is just as false that dogs go out and try and eat each other. I'm sure some dogs eat another dog, but in general, not only in general, in almost the majority of cases, dogs would much rather play with each other than eat each other. It's not only a misdescription of dogs, it's a misdescription of the world. Mm-hmm. And what we're really learning is, as we explore how trees support each other, how nature supports each other, how humans evolved because of our altruism more than our competition, that it's part of a complete misunderstanding of the true nature of nature. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts about, so what is the true nature of nature? So how is compassion something that just some of us have to learn meditation to do, or is it endemic in our natures? Are we all potentially compassionate if society would just let us be?
Well, I have heard that dogs don't really eat dogs, but as you know, it is such a common phrase, and one of the things that I've enjoyed exploring with people, because it is an ethic that so many people have. Strangely enough, I think if we look more deeply, we
So what I'm
see,
asking is, do
yeah.
people have it, or do people think they're supposed to have it?
I think people have it, but I think we have to look more deeply to discover interconnection, basically. The way we respond to one another. Like my favorite thing to do going into an organization, for example, to teach, is to ask people, who else has to be doing their job well for you to do your job well? Because even if we don't feel like we're part of a team, we're part of a team. And if that makes no sense, and sometimes it doesn't make sense, do you commute to work? Do you ever think about that car mechanic or the train engineer? And if you don't commute, if you work at home and you're relying on technology, do you ever think about that, And if sometimes none of that resonates with people, and I say, well, did you eat today, And if you don't grow all your own food, this, of course, is a very classical reflection, like how many beings have been involved in that plate of broccoli, sitting in front of you one afternoon. Somebody planted a crop and somebody harvested it and somebody transported it. And we live in an interconnected world. And so it's not a gooey kind of compassion, but it's almost like a bone deep recognition that our lives have something to do with one another.
So, but it's so interesting because when you ask who has to do a job well for you to do a job well, I can think of dozens and dozens of people. So the fact that there are people who can't think of somebody shows how isolated our society has become.
Yeah.
I want to go back to societal messages again, because in the past, you and Ethan Nichtern did some work on these two different ways of seeing the world and how they kind of affect how we are in the world. And one was the 3 S's, which is that we're separate, we are scared, and we are selfish. And the antithesis was the 3 C's, that we're connected, we're compassionate, and we're courageous. And my instinct is that because we're so interdependent, actually, we're not autonomous beings. We're deeply related beings. But it's very interesting when you are deeply connected and related to a society, to a social message, which tells you you are separate, you, in terms of being selfish, that it's all about you and you want to gain more and not about others. And that you're scared, which really means that you're threatened by people of another race or another condition or another something or other. So it's so interesting to me that when the true nature of the world is that we're connected and therefore we should be compassionate and courageous, but there are these larger social memes that are misadapting people by telling them that they're separate, scared, and selfish. Okay, so that's a long way of posing a question, which is, so how do we move society from the 3 S's to the 3 C's?
It's not easy, apparently, but I think it is possible. I think, I don't know if it's moving society as a whole, so much as...
We can't move everybody? Come on.
Well, 1 by 1 maybe, or 10 by 10, but because underlying all of that is the belief about what's going to actually make us happy. And if you feel, I'm too vulnerable if I'm connected, I'm better off being scared. That's strength, that's real strength, being vengeful or something like that. It's what we were kind of talking about earlier, being compassionate is for wimps and for fools, everyone's just going to take advantage of you. So for a lot of people, it takes a kind of personal exploration, like, I held on to that grudge for, 15 years. How happy did it make me, And that is not easy to do in terms of a mass movement. It's developing insight and genuine understanding. But I think it's possible. And I think, going back to something you were kind of inferring before, when we see children who are not strongly conditioned into antipathy and separation, there is a kind of natural altruism, it seems, that they exhibit. And so there's a way of recognizing that, I think, and helping nurture that along the way, which I think is pretty important. And seeing through even as an adult, seeing through the myth and the distortion, being separate, selfish, and scared, being something that is delightful. It's also tied up, for us in this society, I think, with a kind of fear of death and a feeling that if we could only fortify ourselves enough, we'll be safe somehow, safe from change, even in some minds, in a way, safe from dying. And so there's the whole ethos of being in control all the time of everything. And it takes a lot of deconstructing to sort of see through that.
See, my belief is you can be compassionate, courageous, and always in control.
It's another C. Well, yeah, controlling.
Yeah, control, right. Yeah, that's what I have not let go. But there's another C I want to bring up, which is challenges in the Real Happiness Challenge. So one of the amazing things you've done in your career through your books and through your teaching is that you're endlessly giving people tools. You're actually not only preaching, but you're giving them pathways. And so I'd love you to talk about the Real Happiness Challenge or any other pathway that you think could really help people.
Well, I think that's kind of the point. That's what I was longing so much for when I went to India, was really tools. And I'd say another community I've been able to work with are survivors of gun violence. And in working with them, that we had a retreat up in Barrie for this group, which was we started the idea of the retreat just for people who'd been involved in Parkland in the school shooting there. But it's so massive a problem that there were people there from everywhere. And the single word that was most appreciated was tools. That's what people wanted. That's what they needed. And they resonated very strongly with that. And I just took note of that. That's what people kept asking for was tools. I need tools. I need a path. I need a way. Like I had an unfortunate experience with a doctor a couple of years ago when I had pneumonia and I was in the hospital, and I left the hospital on 24-hour oxygen, and I ended up seeing a pulmonologist, and they take you off and I went in trailing this oxygen tank, and they take you off and have you walk around with a pulse oximeter on your finger. And then, so she did that, and she said, "You need oxygen, come back in 2 months." And I said, "Tell me how not to need oxygen." And she said, "Come back in 2 months." I found another doctor. But, I understand that yearning. If you believe in a path, that there's some way of not feeling so alone in this challenge or turmoil of connecting, of feeling part of life, we need tools. And so I think it's a really, we don't need sectarian dispute. We need tools. And so we do things like on my website, we do have this Real Happiness Challenge every February of 28 days. I wrote a book some years ago called Real Happiness, and the original subtitle was something like The Power of Meditation, a 28-day program. And it came out in January of that year, and somebody said to me, "Well, February is 28 days. Why don't you run a challenge?" And so we did that, and we do that every year. And every retreat that I teach in some way is really about tools, because people have a lifetime to continue, if they wish, to refine those tools and utilize them in some way.
So tell the audience about some of these tools. So in a Real Happiness Challenge, what are you challenging people to do?
So I think it starts with like 5 minutes of meditation practice. I always am hesitant about that because the first 5 minutes are usually the most difficult 5 minutes, and so saying just sit for 5 minutes is, sometimes a little counterproductive. But
Except you can learn that you can sit for 5 minutes.
yeah, well, that's true. It starts with tools of concentration where we learn to stabilize attention, maybe using the sensations of the breath, something like that, just the normal in and out breath. It's not really a breath exercise. It's a way of getting a little more concentrated and centered. And then we open up that kind of awareness. So we're paying attention to things happening in our bodies and seeing maybe the distinction, if you're in physical pain of some kind, between that and the story, like, I'm going to be this way forever, and it's dire, things like that. We open our awareness to pay attention to emotions and ways we're feeling about things and see more deeply. If you're angry, for example, and you're not freaking out about the anger, but you're paying attention to it, maybe you see sadness, you see fear, and you also see change, things like that. We practice tools of loving kindness, which are actually that kind of intentional wish to pay attention differently. If you're in the habit, for example, of just putting yourself down all the time, you kind of ask yourself, what happens if I wish myself well, for a few moments? Or if you think, I have nothing and life is so bleak and I'm desperate and it's awful, spend a couple of moments asking yourself, did anything else happen today? Like anything to be grateful for? So it's like stepping out of the ruts of our attention and seeing what it's like when we see things from another angle. So there are many kinds of tools that we employ.
And what's the best book of yours for people to read to discover the tools?
Probably Real Happiness, because it is just that. It's a program for paying attention differently.
Mm. And are there places where you have seen the paying attention differently, paying attention positively, spread, where you've seen it's become communalized? It's not just an individual practice. In Buddhism, we have the Sangha. In Judaism, we have the minyan. In Christianity, we have the congregation. In Hinduism, we have the Kumbh Mela with like 100 million people. But I think there's all a recognition that spiritual evolution is a collective action, not just an individual one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I went to Kumbh Mela once, and
Yeah.
like I was at Woodstock. I would just want to say these are my credentials for being a cool person. The very first retreat we actually taught for domestic violence shelter workers, I think, was an example of that. Because we tried to have more than, these were all frontline workers to begin with. We tried to have more than one person per shelter, so this person would not feel so alone. And then before too long, we were being approached by directors and supervisors of shelters who said, there's big staff changes going on, in terms of their well-being. Like, why don't you do a program for us? So then we did a parallel program for them. And they themselves, the directors and supervisors, came up with a phrase, which was establishing a culture of wellness at work. They wanted culture change. They talked about all kinds of different things, growing a rooftop garden, and every single person talked about some space, having a kind of physical space people could go to, not religious or sectarian, but just some space where they could be. And I just watched it grow, as people wanted to establish a culture. And culture could also mean your own body and mind and your desk, your team. It's got varied dimensions. And one woman, who I'll never forget, I quote her all the time, she said, I've decided that in order to establish a culture of wellness, I have to start taking a lunch break. And everyone in the room who did not work at a shelter was completely aghast. And we said, you don't take a lunch break? Like, isn't it in your contract? And she said, oh, yeah, but there's never enough time and there's always something to do and someone's struggling. And she said, but I can't go on until I do that. And then she came, week after week and told us her progress and actually being able to take a lunch break. And so that kind of thing also spreads because it's not seen as weakness or you can't do your job well. Or like, look at that, you're actually smiling. I haven't seen you smile in a month. And, there it goes. I think we do have tremendous influence on one another.
Hmm. So creating a culture of wellness is really, it spreads. So let's just go back again. Empathy is you feel deeply for somebody, but the feelings in a way cause you pain, and compassion is you are able to shift those into action.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And so it is the flow of those feelings
mm-hmm,
through you. They
mm-hmm,
motivate you, but you put them back into the world. In effect, you transform the suffering into positive action. And so
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and that's hard to do alone, particularly when the rest of the world is not supporting that. But when you're part of a culture of wellness, then you're all mutually supporting each other, and
Mm-hmm.
you get the synergetic effect of being part of this. So the culture of wellness has such an amplification effect.
I think it really does. And it's also very tied to mindfulness because when you have that kind of culture, you can admit your fears and your hesitation because you're seeing it, but you're not taking it all to heart. Like I'm a bad person because I'm freaked out, People can share those things, their vulnerabilities, as well as their triumphs and their joys. And it's that kind of culture, where you can pay attention and pay attention collectively in a way.
So Sharon, you have written so much and taught so much. Is there a next? So like, are you writing? So what are you writing now?
I have a lot of balls in the air. Actually, it's like, for one thing, I have a children's book coming out in December. That's the first time. Yeah.
So what age?
4 to 8.
Whoa, do we need this for some grandchildren? Wonderful. Fantastic.
Oh, yes. Okay. It's called Kind Carl. It's about Carl the crocodile who learns to be kind. So,
Okay. So does the crocodile become a vegetarian?
Oh, we didn't go that far. He does. There's loving kindness meditation instruction in the back, but
okay, got
does
it.
he become? His favorite food all along was crepes. So,
okay, got it.
Yeah. And many years ago, I wrote a book called Faith: Trusting Your Own Deepest Experience, which is really kind of my faith journey. And there's some energy around to turn that into a play, a theatrical play. So that's cooking. That's right at the beginning. It looks like I'm going to have a workbook on loving kindness, which is really all tools, coming out next year. And my literary agent came to visit me in New York and sat down with me and said, I want to know what you would want to write. Like, do you have another book and what is it? So I thought about it really deeply, and I came up with, as you know, there's this famous quotation from the Buddha where he said, I teach one thing and one thing only, that is suffering and the end of suffering. And that I wrote her like 3 paragraphs about suffering and the end of suffering, and I think it was like way too depressing for her. So I realized I've got to really flesh that out. It's not about being mired in suffering and being defined by suffering, obviously. It's about recognizing suffering, not being so afraid to admit it, one's own and someone else's. And what are we going to do about that? So I'm sort of in the process of writing a proposal about that. Lots of stuff.
I once was at a retreat with Gelug Rinpoche, and he was talking about suffering, which is the foundation of Buddhism, is recognizing suffering. And Deanne and I had just come from this fantastic camping trip in the mountains, and we had gone on a picnic, and so I said, there are, not everything is suffering. And he said to me, you have to watch out for the picnic spots in samsara.
Nice.
He said, suffering is not all just about pain. It's
Yeah.
actually about being trapped in a constrained sense of self. It's actually being, and what this practice, the practice of meditation and analysis and thinking deeply about the nature of the world helps us see is, a Hopi friend of mine says, how we make ourselves nouns instead of verbs, how we constrain ourselves to these limitations versus these great expanses. And so part of the recognition of suffering is the tremendous opportunity that it offers us once we see the boundaries to recognize we can dissolve the boundaries.
That's true. I had been thinking also, back to caregivers, it's the perfect model of recognizing we don't have control over someone else's situation. We can have influence, we can have effect, we try our best, but we can't seize the moment, and say, I'm in charge now. So it brings us right to those kinds of seeming paradoxes where we have to hold a lot of realities at once. So we are that expansiveness and openness, and at the same time, there are the real limitations of day to day, and we hold them both, hopefully.
And so that in many ways is I was going to call our challenge. It's so funny. You said you're writing a play. That is the play of our lives, to actually recognize those boundaries, those conditions in which we all have to deal with, and yet try and be as open as possible.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah. So Sharon, just one last thing is we're going to link to this show the meditation exercises that you did for the Garrison Institute app for caregivers, so that we can make that accessible to all people. So do you want to just talk a little bit about the history of that, how that came about, and what's in it?
Well, again, Gianna, the great visionary, your wife, really had a sense of wanting these tools to be accessible for people. And so there's a range of exercises that are, again, very practical, very direct, very simple. It's just a question of putting them into practice if you wish. And I find it helps a lot to have some structure. And, some people don't really appreciate having a voice come in, but most people really appreciate it. And it's a help just to bring us back. The essence of learning and meditation practice, as in so many things in life, is being able to begin again. Our minds wander, but that's natural. We can come back. We can get more stable, or we freak out over something. We get consumed by something. That's also natural. We don't have to stay there forever or build, an entire self-image on top of it. We can start over. And so that's a lot of the encouragement that's given by me, through all these various tools, is let's remember the underlying principles, and we can put this into practice.
And they are a wonderful gift. They're short, they're easy, and your voice leads us through. So I encourage our listeners to find them in the show notes or wherever we have them and enjoy them. Sharon, thank you so much for all the work you've done for the world, the work you've done for me and the Garrison Institute, and you've been such a generous contributor to creating a culture of care, and we're very, very grateful for that.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the podcast.
Yeah, and I look forward to our audience enjoying this too. Thank you to our guest, Sharon Salzberg. The Common Good is a production of the Garrison Institute and is hosted by me, Jonathan F.P. Rose. We'd love to hear your thoughts about the podcast. Please send us a note at podcasts@garrisoninstitute.org and let us know what you think. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts. This show is produced by the Garrison Institute with production and marketing from The Podglomerate. Its theme music was composed by Jonathan F.P. Rose and performed by Jog Blues. We look forward to being with you again soon.